So this video lesson is all about adding and subtracting fractions, and it's a follow-up to the work that we did with fractions and the introduction to addition and subtraction of fractions that we did in class today. So in class today, or yesterday, depending on when you are watching this video lesson, we talked about what a fraction is, what the numerator and denominator each mean, and also what it means to add fractions with like denominators. So in this case, if we're looking at a group of marbles, 3 red marbles, 5 blue marbles, and 3 yellow marbles, we could say that we wanted to add the fraction of red marbles to the fraction of blue marbles. And we could do that in a number of different ways. We could just count how many marbles there are, but we could also, as we said, add the numerators and keep the denominator. And in a case like this, it's very easy to see why the denominator remains the same, because in adding the fractions of marbles where we don't have any overlap, the number of marbles in this group hasn't changed. We still have 11 marbles because we're adding small pieces of those marbles together. And that's what happens in any type of scenario when we're adding and subtracting fractions with like denominators, because the way that the whole, the denominator, the way that the whole is split, in this case into 11ths, doesn't change just because we're adding and subtracting pieces of those 11ths. One whole in this case is still 11 11ths, and it doesn't change just because we're adding it. So what we said in class today that I'm going to ask you to write down right now as part of your notes is this idea here. To add or subtract fractions with like denominators, we just add or subtract the numerators depending on what the operation is, and the denominator remains the same. So go ahead, write this down. Do these 3 quick practice problems while you're at it. We'll go over the answers there, and then we'll move on to the next part. So again, if we're just adding or subtracting the numerators, depending on what we see, 3 plus 4 is 7, so that's 7/5. And we can leave it like that, or if you like, we can change it to 1 2/5. Either way, this is in simplified form. Improper fractions are totally fine in this case. They just need to be simplified. And so 1 2/5 or 7/5 are both correct. For 13/7 minus 6/7, we have 7/7 because 13 minus 6 is 7. 7 divided by 7 is 1, so the simplest form we're looking there is 1. And for the third one, as we talked about in class, we have to be careful when we borrow with fractions. We cannot do 3/8 minus 5/8 as it is, so much like when we're adding and subtracting regular whole numbers. We're going to borrow from the 1, but in this case, we're not borrowing 10, we're borrowing 8 because of the whole value is made up of 8/8. So 3 plus 8 is 11. 11/8 minus 5/8 is equal to 6/8, and we'll need to simplify that down into 3/4. And so that's adding and subtracting with like denominators, like we said in class. But now what if we have things with unlike denominators, such as 1/4 plus 5/8? Now, depending on the class that we had today, you may or may not have talked about and brought up some ideas about how we add and subtract fractions with unlike denominators. But to see why this is potentially difficult, let's take a look at 2 different pizzas. And in this case, we're going to talk about thirds and fourths. Pizzas or pies or groups of things are often really helpful ways of starting to talk about fractions in very tangible forms. And so the question is, if, for example, we had 1 slice of the pizza at the left and 1 slice of the pizza at the right left, we could talk about it as a fraction of a complete pizza because the pizzas are the same size. But because we have a third and a fourth going on here, it's really difficult to put those together and say exactly what fraction of pizza we have. And we don't want just an estimate, although we could estimate it. We would want to know exactly what fraction is that. And in order to do that, we have to use some things that we've learned about fractions, that we've talked about fractions before. And so I'm going to ask you to pause the video here and come up with some ideas of what are some things we know how to do with fractions already. Not necessarily from lower school or elementary school, though you're welcome to write those down too. What sorts of things have we learned in class so far this year that are going to help us with adding and subtracting fractions with unlike denominators? Go ahead, pause the video, brainstorm on that for a second, and then come back when you're ready to move on. So there are 2 major things here that are going to help us. And you may have learned how to do this in earlier grades, but the things that we've talked about so far this year that are going to help us is, 1, we know how to add or subtract fractions with like denominators. That's what we've talked about so far. Now, 1/3 and 1/4 don't have like denominators, but if we could change their denominators to be the same, then we could add fractions with like denominators, and that's where the second thing comes in, which is we know how to create equivalent fractions. That is, we know how to change the numerator and denominator by the same scale, so that the value of 1/3 is maintained, but the fraction looks different, has a different numerator and a different denominator. And as it turns out, those are the only two things we need to know how to do to be able to add fractions of like and unlike, or of unlike denominators. We need to be able to find a common denominator, because if their denominators are the same, we can add them like we did in previous slides. And so the least common denominator of 3 and 4, the lowest number they both go into, is 12. And so transforming 1/3 to 12ths, that is 4/12. Multiply numerator and denominator by 4. Transforming a 1/4 to 12ths is 3/12. Multiply numerator and denominator by 3, and now we can add them together. 4/12 plus 3/12 is equal to 7/12, which is not immediately obvious if all we're looking at is putting these two fractions of pizzas together. We can't just look at that and say, oh, that fraction of pizza is 7/12, because our eyes are not that good in terms of finding things particularly like that. And so, because we found common denominators and then we're able to add the numerators, we were able to add those individual fractions with unlike denominators. And that turns out to be the process that we want. To add or subtract fractions with unlike denominators, we need to rewrite them using a common denominator, and that can be the least common denominator. It can be a larger denominator if you want. Least common denominators will make the process as simple as we can. And then you add or subtract the rewritten fractions as you would, as we talked about before, when they have like denominators. So go ahead and write down everything in this green box. You don't have to write down the purple star there, although you can if you want to. But write down that entire process for adding and subtracting fractions with unlike denominators, and come back when you're ready to move on to an example problem and then some practice problems. So let's take a look at a quick practice that we'll do all together. 3/4 minus 2/3. Again, the common denominator for 4 and 3 is 12. So you want to turn this into fractions out of 12, because that's the common denominator that we can find. For the 3/4, we need to multiply by 3 in numerator and denominator to get 9/12. For the 2/3, we need to multiply by 4 in the denominator to get 12. So we multiply by 4 in the numerator to get 8, and then 9 minus 8 is 1/12. And that's it. That's all there is to adding and subtracting fractions with unlike denominators. If we have a mixed number, you're welcome to transform it to an improper fraction if you want, but you're welcome to leave it as a mixed number also if you prefer. And so here, our last page, you have 4 practice problems to work on. Go ahead, work on these in your notebook. Come back when you are ready to move on. So for the first set of fractions up in the upper left, we have 3/11 plus 3/22. The least common denominator of 11 and 22 is 22, so 3/22 can stay the way it is. 11ths we need to change to 22 by multiplying by 2, so we have 6/22 plus 3/22 is the same as 9/22. For the first one. Moving over to the right, 5/8 minus 1/2, the least common denominator of 8 and 2 is 8. So 5/8 stays the way it is. 1/2 is the same as 4/8. We can either multiply numerator and denominator by 4, or just know that 4 is half of 8. So 1/2 is the same as 4/8. And therefore 5/8 minus 4/8 is 1/8. And that is the answer to 5/8 minus 1/2. Now at the bottom we have some mixed numbers, so we can either change them to improper fractions or use mixed numbers. I'm going to keep them as mixed numbers here, but I'll give the answer both as an improper fraction and a mixed number if appropriate. So for 2 1/4 minus 1 3/10, we need to find a common denominator of 4 and 10. That common denominator is 20. And so we can multiply by 5 for 1/4 to get 2 5/20. We multiply by 2 and 1 3/10 to get minus 1 6/20. Now here we're at a situation where we can't do 2 5/20 minus 1 6/20 as it is, because 6 is greater than 5. So we need to borrow from the 2 and take 1 whole away. In this case, we're borrowing 20/20, so it is 25/20, because 5 plus 20 is 25. 25 twentieths minus 1 6/20. So 1 minus 1 is 0. 25 twentieths minus 6 twentieths is 19 twentieths, which is the fraction that we're after there. Again, remember, if you're borrowing in this case, we're borrowing 20 twentieths because in this problem, we are breaking this, each whole is broken down into twentieths. And then for the last one over on the bottom right, 1 and 14/15, that is actually the least common denominator there. When it comes to 2 and 1/5, multiply by 3 to get plus 2 and 3/15. Add those together, and initially you get 3 and 17/15, but we can't leave it as a mixed improper number, whatever that would look like. And so 17/15 is the same as 1 and 2/15. So 3 and an additional 1 and 2/15 is the same as 4 and 2/15, which is what we want. So as a quick review, to add and subtract fractions of like denominators, you just add or subtract the numerators as appropriate, depending on the operation. To add or subtract fractions with unlike denominators, we use what we know about equivalent fractions to rewrite them with a common denominator and then add or subtract as we normally would.